Some car companies' commitment to producing performance vehicles tends to waver over time, and some companies really seem dedicated to this philosophy. Honda is one of the latter. They've been bringing us the Civic Si for quite some time, and of course we have the Civic Type R, the pinnacle of Honda's affordable performance line. Now, affordable performance is of course relative. This guy right here stickers for under $37,000 before destination, but you'll be really lucky if you can find one of these on a dealer lot without a big dealer markup on it. If you can find one of these for MSRP, you should just run out and buy one right now. Although there's likely a new Civic on the horizon relatively soon, Honda decided to give the Type R a little bit of a tweak for 2020, and we're talking a very slight tweak, of course. We have a very slightly restyled front end, we have a few more gadgets on the vehicle. Honda sensing is finally standard in the Type R. We have a few light changes on the inside as well, but the bulk of what has made the Civic Type R so frankly impressive is all still here. As you'd expect of any modern performance car, there are a ton of different ducts and vents. Most of them are functional, but there are a few that are styling only. This hood scoop is one of the fully functional variety. This helps cool the engine bay by introducing cool air towards the back of the engine compartment, help move that heat out of the bay right there. There are definitely some functional vents up front that help relieve pressure, help improve cooling. And there's an interesting one right over here on this side. There's a little hole right there in that cutout. That actually is to help the horn noise come out. Honda tells us that without that cutout, they thought that the horn would be just a little bit too quiet. The big change up front, if you can call this a big change, is this small body colored strip right here on either side of the front end. The other change isn't really visible, and that is that we have a radar sensor up here because we now have that Honda Sensing Active Safety Package standard on all Type R models. Other than that, this looks like an angrier version of the rest of the Civic lineup. We have this aggressive bottom splitter down here with red trim, larger grille openings for more cooling for this 2-liter turbocharged engine, and then blacked out trim all the way around. We also have full LED headlamps up front. These remind me a lot of what we see in the Acura line. They're an LED reflector design. The LEDs are firing down and then being reflected forward. Honda has been rolling out their active safety technologies known as Honda Sensing to every vehicle in their lineup. But there has been one big caveat in the past, and that is that you could not get Honda Sensing with a manual transmission. But that's different for 2020. We now see other Honda vehicles available with Honda Sensing and manual transmissions, including this Type R. Honda Sensing gives us pre-collision warning, pre-collision braking, radar adaptive cruise control, and lane keeping assistance, and it works with the little camera right there behind the window. A nice touch with this adaptive cruise control system is that you can use the clutch and use the shifter and it will remember your speed. So if you have the cruise control set to 55 miles an hour, you start climbing a hill and you need to downshift, put the clutch in, shift to 4th gear, pull the clutch back out, and Honda Sensing takes back over. Moving around to the side, we find unique wheels and tires in the Type R, just as you'd expect, but a little bit unexpected is that for 2020, we're getting 2-piece rotors up front. You don't normally find 2-piece rotors on affordable performance cars like the Type R, so I'm really excited about this change. The reason you want a 2-piece rotor design if you're going to be tracking your vehicle or if you just like driving your Civic Type R really hard is that the rotor and the hat can expand and contract at different ratios, and that leads to less warping over time. We also have those massive Brembo calipers up front. From this angle, you can really see the aggressive lines in the Type R. This is 3.1 inches wider than a regular Civic hatchback, and that's all to accommodate the wider tires. You'll see that we have different quarter panels up front. I think Honda has done a really good job of making the vehicle wider without making it look like an afterthought. So they didn't tack on fender flares like we see in some other sports cars out there. Depending on how you want to look at it, these vents up front are operational, but are they fully functional? That is apparently a bit of a debate. They help relieve pressure around this quarter panel area on the inside, but they're not cooling the engine compartment directly. Most of the air for that actually comes from the vents up front. Moving to the rear, we do find a tacked on fender flare right here, and that's because this main portion of the body would have been a lot more expensive to alter, but we do get a unique bumper out back, and I think overall that integrates pretty well. You'll see that little cutout right there for the rear door to open. And then continuing all the way to the rear, you'll notice the unique styling that we see in the Civic hatchback. This doesn't really look like a traditional hatchback in the way that a Volkswagen Golf does, for instance. This is somewhere between a sedan and a hatch in a way, or perhaps a liftback, because the rear glass is a little bit more horizontal than it is vertical. And then, of course, we have this absolutely massive wing on the back. Honda clearly subscribes to the more is more philosophy of design, so instead of replacing the factory spoiler, they just added to it the enormous wing on top, giving this one of the few cars from the factory that has 2 spoilers. At the bottom of the bumper, we have 3 exhaust tips because, again, one is simply not enough. On the roof, we have small fins to help clean the air as it goes by, so that way those spoilers will do their job. As we saw in the front, there's a red line that wraps all the way around the vehicle, helping draw things together. If you like the low wing look that is available in other markets, you should know that unfortunately the hatch cannot simply be transported onto the North American market Type R. They tell us that the hinge and mount points are not the same. Although 3 exhaust tips sound a little excessive, they make a little bit more sense when we talk about what's going on here. Honda decided they didn't want to give us an active exhaust system because that is quite expensive. So instead, they used tuned resonators back here to do essentially the same function. Depending on the engine RPM, exhaust gases can either come out all 3 exhaust tips or just the outer 2 exhaust tips. You'll notice that in most long-distance driving, just the outer exhaust tips are being used. These are the ones that are a little bit dirtier. You can see that right there. This design gives you the resonance that you want for a really great exhaust note if you're driving the vehicle hard, but it also makes it quieter out in highway situations where you don't want that droning effect. Under the hood, we get a unique 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder engine. This is, of course, related to the engine that we find under the hood of the 2-liter Accord, or, of course, certain Acura models, but this particular engine is unique to the Type R. Power comes in at 306 horsepower and 295 pound-feet of torque. Only one transmission is offered. It's a 6-speed manual, so very much like we see in the Civic Si, and fuel economy comes in at 25 miles per gallon combined. Not too bad for 306 horsepower, because the Civic Type R weighs only 3,121 pounds. The reason the Type R is so light relative to its direct competition is that we don't have all-wheel drive. This is a front-wheel drive performance vehicle only. That's also one of the ways that the Type R got to its relatively low MSRP of just under $37,000. By avoiding the cost, complexity, and weight of all-wheel drive, Honda hopes to give us a higher performing and more reliable and more fuel-efficient performance car. By eliminating the weight and complexity of all-wheel drive, Honda promises to give us a more efficient, more reliable, and lower maintenance performance vehicle. This is the point where most people would say that 300 horsepower on the front wheels is absolutely insane. And I have to say that before I drove the Type R for the first time, I was definitely in that camp, largely because I had a Volvo V70R once. It had 300 horsepower, and when its all-wheel drive system went offline, 300 horsepower definitely overwhelmed the front suspension and front suspension design. But somehow, Honda has worked some black magic, and that is absolutely not a problem in the Type R. And I'm not kidding. Part of the reason for that is a unique front suspension design that almost completely eliminates torque steer. This overall front suspension design is not too far off what we see in some GM vehicles with their hyper-knuckle technology. Part of Honda's black magic is obviously a limited slip differential up front, but also a unique front suspension design. Part of how Honda gets there is a limited slip front differential and, of course, a unique suspension design that helps better align the steering axis with the overall suspension motion axes going on there. This is a very similar concept to what we see in Ford and GM's hyper-knuckle and hyper-strut technology, but it is taken to a different level here in the Type R. Before we move on, let's take a look at some of the other details under the hood. This aluminum shield helps direct the air that comes in from that functional scoop over to the sides and helps push it out towards the rear. And then you'll notice that the prop rod has 2 different prop rod locations. One that allows us to open the hood really tall. That makes working on the engine, especially getting to the back of the engine bay, an awful lot easier. This is a touch that I really love and we don't see in many vehicles out there. Something I really appreciate with this seat design is that we don't have a terribly aggressive shoulder area. And in some sport seats out there, it feels like you're practically hugging yourself in order to get into the seat because the shoulder area is so constrictive. Now, I tend to like sitting a little bit closer to the steering wheel when I'm driving a manual transmission vehicle. So if I pull this all the way back, you'll notice that there's definitely enough room for taller drivers out there. We have a tilt telescopic steering column with a pretty decent range of motion. It's the same basic column that we find in the rest of the Civic lineup. When it comes to overall front seat comfort, I'm going to have to dock a few points off of this seat design because we don't have any adjustment for the seat bottom cushion tilt, and there's no available lumbar support either. Hopping into the back seat, you'll notice a few things right away. The first thing is we have a lot of legroom. The Civic is one of the best in the segment when it comes to overall legroom. Sitting right here behind myself, even with this thicker front seat than we find in the regular Civic, I still have about 4.5 inches of legroom left. Unfortunately, I don't have as much headroom as you'd expect in a hatchback. Typically, rear seat headroom is one of those reasons you might want to buy the hatch version of a particular car. And in this vehicle, because of this really plunging roofline, my head is touching the ceiling. I have to crane my head to one side in order to actually put it back there towards the headrest. Scooting over to the right side, I noticed a few other things. We don't have any vents here in the center console, so no air vents for the back passengers, and no fifth seat belt. Civic Type R is a 4-seat vehicle only, but the rear seats do get red seat belts and red stitching, which is something that a lot of sports cars leave out. The rear seats fold in a 60-40 fashion, and they fold almost completely flat with the cargo area in the back. Headroom in the rear may be limited, but thanks to the overall length of the Civic hatchback, cargo space is certainly not. We find 25.7 cubic feet of storage space back here. That allowed me to get 5 of our 24-inch roller bags back here. This is the largest cargo area you'll find in a compact hatchback or compact sedan outside of something like a Prius or a Hyundai Ioniq, which aren't really competition. But you should know that this cargo area is shaped a little bit differently than something like the cargo area in the Volkswagen Golf. You can really see how drastically raked that rear hatch is. We have a cargo cover that rolls over to the side rather than front and back. That makes the cargo area a little bit longer and a little bit shallower than something like a Golf. So depending on the kind of cargo you plan on carrying, one may be a little bit more practical than the other, but you have absolutely no problem putting 22-inch roller bags all the way around. As you might have guessed, they didn't design the Civic Type R's trunk to accommodate a spare tire large enough to wrap around the Type R's brakes, so instead we just get a can of Fix-A-Flat in the back. Hopping inside, you'll notice that things haven't radically changed. We have that camera right there behind the rearview mirror, no sunroof up there because that would add weight and it might also compromise structural rigidity. Moving over to the driver and front passenger sides, we have height adjustable shoulder belts, fixed headrests. You can see that they're part of this seat design. These appear to be 5-point harness seats, but they're not designed to accommodate 5-point harnesses right from the factory. We have Type R embroidered right there on the front seats. Rear seat styling is a little bit more similar to the regular Civic, although again we do get those red shoulder belts and the red stitching back there, which is a really nice touch, because in a lot of performance vehicles they maintain those touches only for the front seats. Moving back up to the front seats, you'll notice that the seats themselves are a combination of Alcantara, which is an imitation suede material, and this black fabric that sort of looks like it was borrowed out of a Nike sneaker. Moving down the seat, you can see that really aggressive side bolster right there and the even more aggressive seat bottom bolster. So again, keep those in mind. If you're someone that's a little bit larger than I am, you might find these seats just a little bit restrictive. Moving over to the front doors, this is basically the same panel that we see in the regular Civic with some extra accents. So we have hard plastics down there around that bottle holder, and unique door trim up above that combines the red accent lines that we see all over the Type R with, of course, some of that red stitching. And those red accents continue all the way around the dashboard. You notice we have that red loop that circles all the way around. More of that distinctive trim right there. Some soft touch materials on the midsection and upper section of the dashboard. A pretty large bin-style glove compartment. I had no problem fitting a large iPad inside. In the center of the dash, the red line continues around those air vents. We have a center channel speaker up there. And then we have the same infotainment system that we've seen in the Civic for a while now. This is probably one of my least favorite infotainment systems available in North America right now, but it does give us Apple CarPlay and Android Auto integration. And the big change for 2020 is that that integration is going to be giving us another Honda app that we don't have available yet, but it's going to be giving us data logging, track timers, etc. That looks really cool, and I really hope that Honda continues to offer that app in future vehicles. The software is easy to use and attractive looking, but the responses can be pretty sluggish, and overall reliability has been a little bit of a problem in every Civic that I've been in so far. Below that, we have the controls for the dual zone automatic climate control. If I hit this climate button, you'll notice it pulls up an integrated screen right there on that multi-touch display. Under the climate controls, we have a storage area where you can very easily put your smartphone, and there's a cable pull-through right there, because if I look all the way to the back, you'll notice the cable drops down to below that area. There's a storage area right below that, and that is where we find the USB inputs. The 6-speed is the only transmission offered. You can see that we have a metal shifter here. It's become a little bit heavier for 2020, and reverse is to the right and back as God intended. I really dislike it when reverse is up over here on the left. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comments section below. This shifter has a really great weight to it. That's something that Honda has always done an excellent job at, is overall shifter feel. Behind the shifter, we have our serial number plate. This is Type R 35607. This is an international total right here. So this is not the number that have been imported to North America. We have a brake hold button here, which is a nice touch. An electric parking brake, which I think is a little bit unfortunate. I would have liked to have seen a hand brake over here for some extra hooliganism. And then over here, we have a controller for the drive mode. We have race, sport, and comfort. The drive modes don't just change throttle mapping, they also adjust the suspension, since we do have an adaptive suspension. And rather unfortunately for 2020, we also have digitally augmented engine noises, and that changes based on drive mode. The center console is is wrapped in the same Alcantara fabric that we find in the front seats. We have an armrest that slides forward and backward like that and moves out of the way to give access to this very deep and large storage area. We have a slidable or removable cup holder set up there, easily able to accommodate large takeout drinks, and then a slidable or removable little shelf. If you removed all of these dividers, then you'd have absolutely no problem stacking up some half-gallon milk containers in there. We have essentially the same instrument cluster as the rest of the Civic lineup, which features this large 7-inch LCD right there in the middle. The displays are a little bit different for the Type R, however. We have our turbo pressure gauge right there. You can toggle around things like your shift indicators, tells you when to shift. We have a G readout. We also have a stopwatch there for timing yourself. Typical fuel economy, turn-by-turn navigation directions, infotainment readouts, etc. And then over here on this screen, we have throttle versus brake pressure. And on this screen, you'll notice that rather unfortunately, the Type R does not let you rev above 3,500 RPM when you're stopped. The biggest change inside is the steering wheel, where instead of a leather-wrapped wheel, we now have this Alcantara-wrapped wheel with these red inserts down here at the bottom. It has a very slight flat bottom design, and then moderate sport grips up top. These are not as aggressive as we find in some cars out there. I love the look and feel of Alcantara steering wheels, however, I am a little bit concerned about longevity, since this is the touch point in the car that you're always going to be handling. Hopefully that's something that Honda and the maker of this fabric have been able to work out. On the left side of the wheel, we find dedicated phone buttons, volume up, down, voice command button. This button changes the screens on that multifunction display, and then this toggle over here works as track forward, backward, as well as controls for the multifunction LCD cluster. Over on this side, we find the controls for the radar adaptive cruise control. We have a button to enable and disable the lane keeping assistance system. Rather unfortunately, I'm not driving this Type R out on a track, and that is a pity. The launch event was supposed to be on a track in Georgia. Unfortunately, it got canceled due to coronavirus. Now that said, I have driven the Type R out on a track before, and this is a ton of fun, whether we're talking about a track or just your favorite winding mountain road. Let's get the numbers out of the way first. 0 to 60 in this model happened in 5.2 seconds. Now theoretically this could go faster if you're a professional driver and you're really roasting the clutch and you get perfect launches. Obviously you could get a better 0 to 60 time. But because this is a manual transmission, driver of course is the biggest factor in the 0 to 60 time. In our braking test, this model stopped from highway speeds back to 0 in 98 feet, one of the shortest stopping distances we've ever recorded. And the brake feel is really great. It's worth noting that the two-piece rotor design doesn't really affect braking distance, so stopping distance is not going to be different 2019 to 2020. It just affects the overall ability of that rotor to stand up to the heat and the repeated abuse if you decide to take this out on a track. One of the amazing things about this Civic Type R we'll discover right here. So I'm just going to have a soft start here and then floor it around this corner. This is normally a place where you couldn't do that in a front-wheel drive car because of torque steer, but somehow Honda has managed to bake almost all the torque steer out of the Type R. Now there is still a little bit. You can still feel a little bit of a pull here and there, but the combination of the suspension design and that limited slip differential remove 99% of the torque steer. In fact, you arguably have more torque steer in some front-wheel drive based all-wheel drive cars out there. For instance, some Mercedes AMG models have a hair more torque steer if you're doing things right. The advantage to Honda working the magic that they did with the Type R is that this is several hundred pounds lighter than the competition that has all-wheel drive. And it reduces the center of gravity because you don't have to have that prop shaft, you don't have to have the overall vehicle a little bit higher, you don't have to have all those other components that would affect the overall curb weight and the center of gravity. Now, without question, we still have a lot of weight on the front axle, over 60% on the front axle, but somehow, again, the Type R just doesn't feel like that. Overall grip is absolutely incredible. We don't have access to a skid pad here at Alex and Autos, but publications that do have recorded over 1G in lateral acceleration. That is absolutely insane. That is Porsche 911 territory. And we're talking about a vehicle that is under $40,000. If you want something that is just an absolute blast to drive hard out on your favorite road, this is one of the best options, period, available in America. This gives you the kind of fun and directness that you can find in some sports cars out there at a lower price with an awful lot more thrust than you'd find in something like a Mazda Miata. Now, I have to admit that there are times where I would like something like Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system in this Civic. I would love it if it could kick the rear tires out a little bit, but that would change the character of the Civic, and the Civic is just very confidence-inspiring. That's probably the best way to describe this. This is the car that will make you feel like you're a superhero out on the road, even if you're a relatively average driver. And the limits are so high in the Type R that you can really go places you couldn't in other vehicles. It's that combination of really high limits and accessibility that makes the Type R so much fun out on the road. When it comes to handling, without question, this gets an A+. I also think the ride is pretty darn good. The surprising thing about this suspension tune is that even in race mode, which is what I'm in right now, the Type R is still a relatively comfortable performance vehicle. This is not as rock hard as some sports cars out there. Now, Honda didn't need to make this as absolutely firm as some of those aftermarket tunes that you see in order to deliver excellent performance from the factory because of the light curb weight and the lower center of gravity. The one downside to all this fun and the lightweight is, of course, cabin noise. In our cabin noise test at 50 miles an hour, we got 75 decibels in here. This is one of the loudest cabins that we've ever tested. Under throttle, obviously, some of that sound is coming out of the speakers. Not everything is coming out of the engine. And that is obvious if we, for instance, toggle this down to the comfort mode, where things do get a little bit quieter. We don't have an active exhaust system. Instead, we have auxiliary noises coming from the engine computer. It's a little bit difficult to talk about fuel economy because we have been having a lot of fun in the Type R, and our fuel economy average has dropped down to about 18 miles per gallon overall. But if you treat this gently, then the 26 miles per gallon is definitely achievable. Around that corner back there, we did get just the faintest hint of torque steer. But again, a 300 horsepower front-wheel drive car from just about anybody else, we would have been in the bushes. And that brings me back to the thing that I keep coming back to, all-wheel drive or not all-wheel drive. I am really torn. I love all-wheel drive, and I love the way the Golf R feels with that all-wheel drive system out on the road. I love the way Acura's super handling all-wheel drive system feels, and of course the related Honda systems that they offer in certain Honda vehicles as well. And I would really love to know what the Civic could do with all-wheel drive. If Honda can work this much magic with front-wheel drive, imagine what they could do with 2 extra wheels being powered. But specifically, this vehicle versus some of the competition, versus the Subaru WRX, versus the Golf R, no, I don't miss all-wheel drive, but I still am forced to wonder, what would it be like in here? Bottom lining the Type R is shockingly easy. This is an absolute hoot and a half to drive. It's comfortable enough to use as a daily commuter. It's affordable enough to use as a daily commuter for many folks out there, and your weekend fun car as well. My only major complaints on the interior have to do with the infotainment system. The pedals are not quite laid out for optimum heel-toe driving, but it can be done if you want to. Of course, you don't really need to because we have excellent rev match shifting with this manual transmission. And again, as a commuter vehicle, this adaptive cruise control system is really cool. So I will engage it right here. We're going 43 miles an hour, and then I will just row through the gears at 43 miles an hour, and the adaptive cruise control system just keeps right along. That's a feature that we don't see in that many vehicles out there with manual transmissions, including some very expensive German cars. With the refresh of the Civic Type R sort of being a swan song to this generation of the Honda Civic, I really wonder, is the Civic Type R going to return to America in the next generation? I really hope that Honda does, but I can't really say for sure. So if you want a Type R, you may want to act fast. Without a doubt, the Civic Type R is one of the most fun vehicles you can buy right now in America under $40,000. Again, MSRP is theoretically under $37,000 before dealer markup, before destination as well. That makes this less expensive than comparably high horsepower WRXs, for instance, or a Volkswagen Golf R. The Golf R only gives you 288 horsepower at the moment, and it is heavier. Now, it does give you all-wheel drive, which I love, but the Civic Type R might make a believer out of you if you're an all-wheel drive fan and you think that every vehicle like this must have all-wheel drive. The Civic Type R honestly does pretty well without it. One of the big reasons for that is the overall weight. You can definitely feel that the Golf R and the Subaru WRX are heavier than the Civic Type R, and that's one of the big reasons that Honda decided not to do all-wheel drive. Because even though something like a Subaru WRX STI has 310 horsepower, a little bit more than this, it's not going to be quite as quick because of that added weight. There's also the added fuel economy penalty and the extra maintenance expense for having all-wheel drive. Two factors that are probably critical to people that are shopping in this segment because, again, this is an affordable performance vehicle, not an $80,000 or $90,000 or $100,000 performance car where you assume that regular maintenance costs are just not an issue. Because performance cars tend to come and go in America, the WRX and the Golf R are really the only true direct competitors to the Civic Type R at the moment. You could look at something like a Hyundai Veloster N as an alternative, but it's not quite the same thing. The Veloster N is a subcompact vehicle. It's a full-size smaller than the Civic, and even though the Veloster N is a little bit newer in terms of its overall general design versus the Civic, because it is one step down the food chain, it's less expensive and it feels less expensive on the inside. I do like its infotainment system more than we find in the Civic, and it is absolutely crazy good fun out on the road, but the Civic Type R feels a little bit more grown-up. It doesn't necessarily look more grown-up with this enormous wing in the back, but it definitely feels more grown-up out on the road. And it is a little bit bigger, a little bit more comfortable as well. On the downside, you will have to pay for it because this is going to be at least $10,000 in all likelihood more than the Veloster N with the performance package, which is going to give you pretty similar overall acceleration because it is smaller. You could also logically compare the Civic Type R to the higher horsepower front-wheel drive options from competitors like Audi, BMW, or Mercedes-Benz. 20 years ago, it may have sounded crazy to compare a high-output Civic to a Mercedes-Benz, but remember, we now have front-wheel drive Mercedes available in America, the CLA and, of course, the A-Class. Those Mercedes models are an absolute blast to drive out on the road, but they're going to be significantly more than this Honda Civic. And in some situations, I think the Civic is a little bit more fun. It certainly has a little bit more personality. At the moment, my bottom line is if you are looking for one of the best performance bargains under $40,000, you should definitely put the Civic Type R on your shopping list. But I would also say you should probably put the Hyundai Veloster on your shopping list as well, as long as you can handle something that is even smaller. The Veloster is considerably smaller than the Civic Type R. It's an awful lot of fun, but there are actually some deals to be had over there at the Hyundai dealer with that model. Just remember, it's not quite the same thing as what we're looking at here. Let me know what you think about that down there in the comment section below, and let me know, would you choose something like a Golf R or a WRX because they have all-wheel drive over something that handles, honestly, as well with front-wheel drive and is therefore a little bit simpler overall? Let me know down there in the comment section below. Be sure and check out all of our other related videos. Find us over at Instagram, over at Facebook, etc., and I'll see all of you later.